Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well as we continue our streaming of the service and Sunday school hour. But today, we're going to talk about the book of Job. If we get there today, I'd like to start out, if I could, just to kind of look at the first 17 books that we've been studying in the Old Testament. We've been doing an Old Testament survey and 17 books. And I'd like to just kind of go back and briefly give you some things that's from these books, these 17 books. And so we'll start out in a quick review. It's not going to be very extensive, but it'll kind of give you an idea. One of the major things, and the reason we're doing this study, is that it's very much a history. It's very much of Israel's history and the things that have occurred. And once you get into that and you start looking at that and you really get down and you study it, when things come up, you know about the era, time that it occurred, and therefore you know which book to go to find the answers to your questions. But so we'll start out today. We'll begin in the book of Genesis, naturally. And in Genesis, we see the sovereignty of God in creation, the fall of man, and the election and the choosing of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants, and the promise of Canaan as their predestination and the inheritance. So we kind of look at that, and this is what we're going to be doing for the first part of this lesson, is kind of going through each one of those books and giving you a highlight, maybe the theme or something that occurs in those books. But not a great detail, but just a little snapshot of what occurs. In Exodus, we see the redeeming power of God in His deliverance of Israel from Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. In Leviticus, we saw the holiness of God and His insistence on the separation and sanctification of His redeemed people. In Numbers, we see the goodness and severity of God's severity toward the unbelieving generation which came up from Egypt. And during that particular time, we went in and talked about when they left and they crossed the Red Sea and wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Then you get into generations. And the first generation, the first 40 years that they were in there, and in Numbers, we see this. We see the goodness and severity of God's severity toward the unbelieving generation which came up from Egypt, but never entered into the inherited land, Canaan, and goodness toward their children, and providing, and preserving, and protecting till Canaan was occupied. In Deuteronomy, we see the faithfulness of God, faithful to His purpose, His promise, His people, and bringing the redeemed to the promised land. I'd like to point out that these are verbs, key verbs, or as we look at this, for Israel. And one of the things is God was providing, God was preserving, and God is protecting. God has His purpose. God gives a promise and His people in bringing redeemed to the promised possession. So we look at each one of those, and those are the from the Genesis to Deuteronomy, all have to do with Israel's preparation of going into Canaan. This is known as the Pentateuch, the books of Moses. So, the Pentateuch, excuse me. These 12, the next books, these 12 may be further divided. These 12 historical books have to do with Israel's occupation of Canaan. So these 12 historical books that we're getting ready to talk about, these 12 can be further divided into 9 and 3. The first 9 cover the pre-exile, before the remaining 3 cover the post-exile. The remnant is back in the land. The 400 years of Israel's history, from birth of Abraham from Egypt, is known as the tribal period. From the Exodus to Saul, the first king the first of the kings, the period. And we discussed all that prior to and got into in depth of quite a bit of that. So the first of the 9 books is Joshua. We studied Joshua, and we studied the thing that we could say about Joshua is the victory of faith. And what we covered was in chapters 1 through 5, we looked at the entering the land. And then we looked in chapters 6 through 12, overcoming the land. And you can see that the focus is on Canaan. And in 13 through 24, we looked at the occupying the land. The 5 books of Moses led up to Canaan. Joshua complemented these by leading Israel into Canaan. And Canaan is a type. We talked a lot the last time that we were here. We talked a lot about typology, and we talked about pictures in the Old Testament and how it can relate to the New Testament. And you see a type here, a type of Canaan. If Jordan is death, then Canaan has to deal with heaven. So the next book that we got into was the book of Judges, the book of dissension. This book covers roughly the first 350 years of Israel's history in Canaan. The theocratic period. Ruth, one of the greatest love stories in the book. The love that suffers reigns at last. And the book opens when judges ruled. Now, 1 Samuel is known as the transition book, just like the book of Acts in the New Testament is a transition book. 1 Samuel, transition from theocracy to monarchy, covering a period of about 150 years. It covers Samuel, the last judge, Saul, the first king, the people's choice, Saul, and David, God's choice, the greatest king. In 2 Samuel, we look at King David, 40-year reign. The first 20 years of David was triumphant, very successful. 20 years king. The book of disruption, chapters 1 through 11, 40 years reign of King Solomon, 1 through 11. Chapters 12 through 22 is the first 80 years to start off with, and the southern kingdom of Rehoboam. And those two things, the split. You had the 10 tribes that went to the northern kingdom, and then you had 2 tribes that was in the southern kingdom, and Benjamin and Judea. So that is a quick history of that. And 2 Kings is the book of dispersion. The second book of Kings, which opens with the translation of Elijah to heaven and closes with the transportation of the captive Jews of Babylon. In chapter 17 of 2 Kings, we see the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom, Israel, going into Assyrian captivity around 722 BC and have never returned. Chapter 25, Jerusalem is sacked, destroyed, the temple burnt, and Judea going into Babylon, somewhere in the neighborhood of 533 BC, 587 BC, captivity. The 1st and 2nd Chronicles, the house of Jehovah. The books of Chronicles trace the history of Israel from the beginning of the human race, Adam, until the fall of Jerusalem and the subsequent return of the Jews during the reign of the Persian king, Cyrus, the great king, in 559 to 529 BC. This takes us to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, and that was the last books that we looked at. The post-exile. This is after the Babylonian captivity. And the Chronicles is known as the retrospective. Ezra, the restoration. Nehemiah, the reconstruction. And Ezra, the preservation. And in Ezra, the return of the remnant building the temple. And Nehemiah deals with the remnant, which returned to Jerusalem and Judea. And they built the wall. The book of Esther has to do with those who stayed on in the land of their captivity. And there was only 52,000 that returned, and Esther, she stayed with those that stayed on into the land of captivity. Like I said, only 52,000 was the remnant that returned under Ezra and Nehemiah. Now today, what we want to get it started into is the 5 poetic books of the Bible. 5 poetic books of the Bible. We'll be looking at Job. Not today. We're going to be trying to get into the book of Job today. And the 5 poetic books are the Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. And we'll be studying these poetic books. These are emotional books. Emotional books. A lot of information in these books. So let's begin in the book of Job. And excuse me, Job, blessing through suffering, blessing through suffering. And as far as the date of Job, people say that it's the oldest book in the Bible. When was Job written? There is not really a date that you can pin it on, but I can say this. Job had to deal somewhere in the book of Genesis. When all that occurred in Genesis, the book of Job was either penned during that particular time, but probably didn't come out until later on. But anyway, that's not important when it was written or anything. But there's three things in the book of Job that's broken down. You got the prologue, and the dialogue, and the epilogue. So those are 3 things that we're going to be looking at in the book of Job. So let's begin. We cannot understand the meaning of many trials because we know about the book of Job. You've heard a lot of sermons on the book of trials and tribulations. God did not explain them. To explain a trial would be to destroy the object, which is that of calling forth simple faith and implicit obedience. So in the book of Job, it starts out in the first verse. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. And that man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Now we can see that Job was a godly man. Job was godly, and he had a lot of inheritance as we studied the book of Job. Now the first 2 chapters are written in prose. Prose is a type of literary where it's just an ordinary writing, nothing flashy, sentences, paragraphs, and so forth, and serves as a prologue to the poetic saga that follows. The dialogue is a poetic saga when we get into that chapter 3. And then the epilogue, chapter 42, 7 through 17, is also written in prose. So you're going to go back and forth to 2 different styles of writing during this time. The exact location of the land of Uz is uncertain, but it usually associated with Edom, and you get that from Lamentations 4:21. And then you got Job's friends, if you could call them that. As you'll see as we go through this lesson, Job's trials, as we see this, and what they thought was occurring, why he was having to go through this. And but anyway, so one of Job's friends, Eliphaz, was from Teman and well-known Edomite city. 4 great attributes are ascribed to Job, as we have mentioned: perfect and upright, and one that feared God and eschewed evil. So his life could not have been more exemplary. So as we continue on, there's Job was a real person. Job was a real person. It was not a fictitious name to go through this process. And in some books that you read, commentaries, that this was just a type of a person going through the trials and tribulations. Now, we can stop here and we can talk about that, if you stop and think about it, and if you associate the Old Testament with the New Testament, which is very important, if you do that, then as we look at this, could we not say, where in the book does it really talks about people going through the fire, going through the trials, going through the tribulation, those types of things? Naturally, in the book of Revelation, it talks about the tribulation period and tribulation time. And could this be an insight to what's going to occur later on in history? So those are some things, as I read in commentaries, that this was just more or less pointing to that direction. But Job was a real person. This occurred in that particular time. Job probably lived before or around the time of Abraham. Around the time of Abraham. Some have suggested that Job was about 70 years old at the time of the events in the book of Job. He was very wealthy. He and his sons were homeowners in large cities of the region. He was respected and popular judge and benefactor of the fellow citizens. The events related to this book was initiated by God. For God did not allow Job trials because of any sin in his life. Job emerged from this severe testing with a fresh appreciation of God's sovereignty and sufficiency. So, as we look at this, one of the things that we talked about or we looked at is in the first verse, we know that Job was a righteous man. It talks in here in verse 6. Verse 6. It says, and we're talking about the sons of God in this passage. And it refers to the angelic being. Satan is considered one of them through the fall. Satan obtains permission to tempt Job. Obtains permission. He gets permission from God. Gets permission from God to tempt Job. Why? Because Satan went to God and said the only reason that Job, like in chapter 1, is such a righteous man is because he has all this wealth. He has all this, everything going for him, so to speak. Well, God said, have you ever considered my servant Job? And so Satan obtained permission to tempt Job from God. And the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job? Verse 8. And there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and eschewed evil. Then Satan answered the Lord and said, doth Job fear God for naught? And hast not thou made a hedge about him? So Satan was saying that God just put a hedge about it, protecting. There's that word that comes in, that verb. And about his house, and about all that he hath on every side. And that's why Satan said that's why he is a righteous man. And so then you start in verse 13, and it talks about the disasters that befell Job were of human agency. The Sabians, verse 15. And the Sabians fell upon them and took them away. And yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So here we find out that Job is starting those afflictions, and the first thing that occurred was this group, this nomadic group, and it's mentioned in the book of Job. It's mentioned in the book of Job. These people were mentioned in the book of Job. They were mentioned in the book of Joel, Ezekiel, and Isaiah. In Isaiah, they are described as tall of stature. Tall of stature. So as we look at this book, we could go back to Genesis and go through a study of that and do the comparison, but we just don't have time. You can do that on your own. And just go back and look at this point in chapter 15 and go back to Genesis and see if there's any any connections to these. So we're talking about the sons of God. And, you may come up with the same conclusion as most of the commentaries have about that. So, and then in 17, you see the picture of the Chaldeans that come forth. And the Chaldeans also occurred in Job's affliction. So as we continue with Job, and we understand that Job is going through these trials and tribulations, these things that occurred, and there's a whole list of those things that occurred, and the conversation lives with God, but he may well have simply expressed what was on Satan's mind. God's view of Job is the same as the description given in 1:1. So Satan acknowledged the accuracy of God's evaluation of Job, but questioned Job's motives, as we have said. The question of why people serve God is as important as the question of suffering in the story. The hedge that we talked about. The hedge represents all that God does to protect his children. A godly man is invincible until God is finished with him. Now, the disasters that befell Job were of human agency from these two groups, these two Matic groups, and of natural source. Fire and wind, natural source. Through Satan's power was behind it all. The Sabaeans were a nomadic group, as we have said, the Babylon. And all of these tragic events eventually took place on the same day, all at once. And all the hundreds of Job's servants, only 4 survived to bear the bad news. Each human life was lost in all 4 disasters. So, then we look at chapter 2. Satan obtains permission to tempt Job further. Now we're talking about tempting Job further through his health and his well-being. So the second test results in the loss of Job's health. The identification of the diseases signified by sore boils is not clear, though its description is very vivid. In any case, the boils covered his entire body, were visible to others, and were very painful. Job is now so impoverished that he can only scrape himself with a piece of broken pottery. I've suggested that Job do what Satan had predicted. So Satan predicted to God this here. Curse God. After all she had been through, it was no wonder she was ready to give up all hope. So, in a sense, is Satan going through the wife in order to get Job to curse God? Is that possible? Sure it is. But Job recognized that both good and evil came from God's hand. Notice that. Both good and evil come through God's hand. Though one by his action will, and the other by his permissive will. God can permit evil things to happen for God's ends. And that is, Genesis 50, 19 and 20. Go back and look at that, and you'll see the connection. And all that this did not Job sin is proof enough that Satan was wrong and was sorely defeated. Satan does not appear again in the book. Does not appear again in the book. So, and you look at chapter 2, and you start with verse 11. Job and his friends, about Job and his friends. And sometime must have elapsed before the 3 friends arrived at this point, since it would have taken time for them to communicate and then make the trip. Now, I'll say this, in studying this book, and you look at the book, and you talk about a time factor when it occurs, it's not clear. It's not clear of how long this had to do, or how long it had to take to go through this. Some commentators say it taken 7 years. I don't think that it was that. I think more like maybe 3 years, 3.5 years for this to occur all the way through. I don't know. I mean, that's just something that you have to speculate on, you know. And there's some things in here, they talk about it, and studying this, they said that there was 42 chapters in the book. 42 chapters in the book. These are just food for thought. This is just for something for you to think about as you study this particular book. Is it a picture of the tribulation time that's yet to come? Is it a picture of that? Excuse me. So is it a picture of that occurring? It's possible. It's possible. But as we look at this, and in the book of Daniel, it talks about 42 months, the 3.5 years. Could it be that this occurred? This took a time of 3.5 years? I'm not saying it did. I'm not saying it didn't. I'm just saying that's for something that if you want to study it out or look at and maybe look at the connection, that's something that you could do. And all that happened, Job did not curse God. Job still was righteous. So Satan was defeated in what he thought, in what he was going to do. Some time must have elapsed before the three friends arrived, since it would have taken time for them to communicate and then make the trip. Eliphaz seems to have been the eldest and most prominent. He was a Teman, a well-known Edomite city where wise men lived. You can see that in Jeremiah 49:20. Bildad, the Shuhite, that's close enough, lived in the same general area inhabited by the descendants. You know, as I practice at home and I start reading this stuff, I can pronounce these words pretty well. But Brother Caleb's back there and he's grinning from ear to ear because I'm sure that he's had the same problem as I. And then when you get up here, it's just different. Okay, this was one of Abraham's son by Keturah. Zophar also lived nearby in the area of Namath. Like a known about any of these, little is known about any of these men. You know, I think, you know, I don't even think they appear again in the Bible anywhere. Or they may do it somewhere along the line, but anywhere, just in the book of Job, do they talk about Eliphaz? I can't recall. So anyway, Brother Dustin can come in and correct me if he does, and he can give you the scripture and the book and the verse and all that. But these three friends have been considered the most unsympathetic comforters in history. I mean, they came in, and if you read the story and you start looking at Job and his friends and what they did, Eliphaz, and you know how he approached this, and it was because of his sin, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But these three friends have been, you know, they just attacked Job, is a good way to put it, and had a few compliments and maybe paid to them, but did come to visit Job. They did come to visit Job, so that was a positive. They wept with him is another positive, and they kept silent for 7 days and 7 nights, and that's a positive. So their extended silence clearly teaches that they're a time of grief so great that it is better not to speak than to say the wrong thing, as their subsequent conversation revealed. Now, definitely, when you go in, how are you going to approach someone that's going through these trials? You got to think of how you're going to approach it, how you're going to say it. And the first thing that I feel like that should have happened is, number one, is they need to listen. A good friend is going to listen. And then they can understand how that person is feeling. But here's what occurred. Instead of cursing Job, Job cursed his own birth. After this, that is, after 7 days of silence, Job broke the silence. Whereas the first 2 chapters were written in prose, everything in 3:3 to chapters 42 to verse 6 is in poetry. So this is where the poetry talks about poetry, very emotional. And during these times with these friends, that's where it's very emotional at that time. Emotional. Now, so instead of cursing God, Job cursed his own birth. The mourning is better taken, and as an ancient, this ancient sea monster who came to symbolize opposition to God's creative force. To raise up this sea monster would be to bring the world back to a state of chaos and negate the birth of Job. So, those are some things. So in chapter 4, this is where we begin. Eliphaz rebukes to Job. And the actual dialogue, this is where we're starting the dialogue, and this is in the poetry form. And as you read this book, if you think about it in poetry, you can see how it starts out. And different little sections in here. But it's kind of like you would put it in stanzas and those types of things as poetry is written. So as the actual dialogue with his friends begins here in chapter 4, verse 1, takes up most of the book. It consists of 3 cycles in which each friend speaks and Job replies, with the exception that in the 3rd cycle, Zophar does not speak. Eliphaz speaks first because he was probably, if you had to guess, oldest maybe. Doesn't really say, but and the wisest. He was also the most compassionate of the 3. Eliphaz takes the position of a theologian, emphasizing the greatness of God and his judgment of sin. So with that said, and everything that occurred, Eliphaz said that Job must have sinned, that he had committed a sin. And that's why he was being treated this way. God was punishing him for his sin. Bildad takes the position of a traditionalist, emphasizing the principles of justice and the concept of retribution. Zophar takes the position of a moralist, emphasizing the principles of wisdom, which he suggests Job's have violated all 3. To them, take a negative view of Job, assuming that he has done something to bring this trouble on himself. As we know today. Now, you got to understand, did Job have a Bible? Did he have any words from God in his hand at this time? The book of Genesis probably wasn't even written at the time. It wasn't even penned by Moses. So what did Job have? Did Job have anything? He knew God. He was upright with God. But he had nothing. He had nothing there in the Word of God. But he put all his trust and he put all his faith in God. And as we talked about at the beginning, we know what occurs at the very end. We know what's going to happen. And what it is Job blessing through suffering. The thing is, when things occur in real life, when things occur to you in real life, and what I'm getting at is we may have those trials, and we may have that, but we have to look at that, and you have to put your faith in God. That's the key word, faith. And Job put his faith in God. His friends who came along tried to answer why it was happening, wisdom that they needed in order to help Job. The way that I read this, it's entirely opposite of what God did and how it occurred. Because at the very end, God rebukes the three friends. So, all right. So in chapter 4, and you can read this and come up with your own conclusions as to what has occurred. Now, in 4:8, chapter 4, verse 8, even as I have seen, that is, Eliphaz's argument was based on personal experience. Eliphaz's argument was based on personal experiences, meaning you reap what you sow. Therefore, Job must be suffering because of sin. Now, that was Eliphaz's. He was putting he's putting things that occurred to him, and he's trying to put that into perspective. Now, and you start into chapter 5, and Eliphaz's rebukes continue. So Job, as we look at this, Job, in chapter 6 and in verse 14, Job does not really answer Eliphaz's contention, but simply pleads for pity from his friends. He seems to answer the tone of Eliphaz's speech rather than the specific charges. Verse 24 in chapter 6, wherein I have erred. This is a call for specific sins to be cited by his friends, perhaps with a note of sarcasm. Now, in chapter 7, Job now turns to God to continue his lament, his look at this. In 7:12, what Job is saying is, it so needful to watch me as you would watch a threatening sea monster. In 7:20, I have sinned is better if I have sinned. So let's look at verse 20. I have sinned. What shall I do unto thee, O thou preserver of men? Why hast thou set me as a mark against thee, so that I am a burden to myself? 21. And why dost thou not pardon my transgression and take away mine iniquities? For now shall I sleep in the dust, and thou shalt seek me in the morning, but I shall not be. Now, chapter 8 begins Bildad, and a lot of this is the same as what we've talked about, or all three of them have a lot of the same things to say. So there's an alternating movement in the prologue between Job and Satan. Can you not see that? Is not Satan represented as having access to God, as the accuser of the brethren? And you see that also in Revelation 12:10. And do we not see Satan standing in the Lord's presence to accuse Joshua in Zechariah 3:1-2? Also note our Lord's word to Simon Peter in Luke 22:31. Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has obtained you. By asking that, he might sift you as wheat, but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. Did Job's faith fail? No. No. Both verbs, Satan's have obtained and Christ having prayed, are in the Greek tense, which indicates an act already past, as though Christ himself had taken part in some such transaction as those described in Job and Zechariah, and have prevailed against the accuser and the tempter. So the thing that we want to point out, one of the key things, is this right here. Satan approached God, and God said, you can only do these things. Who is in control? Even Satan is going to go out and he's going to put these trials upon Job. God set the ground rules. God is in charge, even over Satan. And we all know that. We all understand that. But here is a good picture of that. This is a great picture. God allowed this to occur, but with certain guidelines. In the tribulation time, God is going to allow these things to occur to the Jews, but only those certain things can occur to the Jews. And God is in control of that as those trials. So, another thing that we want to look at is we see that even the dark mind of Satan is an open book to God. I get that. Even the dark God can read Satan's mind. On the other hand, because he said, have you considered my servant Job? But can Satan read God's mind? The answer is no. This was not a provocation of incitement to Satan. No, God knew what was already there in that evil, designing mind. Because he said, when he got there, he says, he's been going to and fro over the earth. What? Doing things that's evil. Just as he knew Satan's going to go to and fro before ever, he asked, from where do you come? The questions are asked not because God does not know, keep that in mind, but to compel confession on the part of Satan. More literally translated, God's question is, have you set your heart on or against my servant Job? Because there is none like him. Satan replied immediately, prevailed that he had and that he believed his lack of success was because God had hedged Job in too perfectly. Now, I got about a minute here, and I want to finish up the prologue, and then we'll get into the dialogue and so forth, and we'll get into that as well. But anyway, the last thing we see that from Satan's word and doing in this prologue, that the evil one is neither omnipresent nor omniscient. He is a created and therefore local being. God can see into all other minds, but Satan cannot see in his mind. He cannot read my mind, much less force access unless you let him. So, finally, God's eyes are ever on his own people, and especially in times of trial. Same thing in the tribulation time. God's eyes will be on his people. He's going to take them through that. And there's going to be a remnant come out of that. And the very question, have you considered my servant Job, indicates that God also had Job in his thoughts. Now, how the Lord particularizes Job by name, how he actually deliberately set Job by name, dilates that his godly character commends his pity. And, the reason he chose Job, he knew. God already knew what would be the outcome and what would happen. And Satan would be defeated and set back another time. Okay, that's all I have for today. That's quite a bit of stuff. But it's good stuff. Get into the book of Job and really study it. Your attention, and thank you very much.